for our next storyteller, the COVID pandemic has had a lot of unique challenges, but being in quarantine for the lockdown and the COVID pandemic was nothing compared to the 50 months that they spent imprisoned before that. Since his release, Joshua Edward Wright has worked on dismantling the prison industrial complex system within. They've done that through their nonprofit, Liberty Literacy. Did I get it right? Liberation Literacy, excuse me. Liberation Literacy, that's why I have my paper. And also through their publication, All Rise Magazine. Here to tell you about their particular year during the COVID pandemic, I want you to welcome to the stage Joshua Edward Wright.
Hello. I was born with cystic fibrosis. And for those of you that aren't aware, cystic fibrosis is a genetic terminal illness that mainly affects the lungs and the pancreas. And there's other things associated with it, like joint pain. I have to do breathing treatments multiple times a day. I have to take pills every time I eat. A multitude of things to try and keep the symptoms down. And when I was little, I was diagnosed when I was 2. But from the time I was born until I was 7, I grew up in a very abusive and dangerous household. My father was an abusive alcoholic, and he was very, I would say, unstable and chaotic. And so I always had to figure out ways to remain safe in terms of, like, in the eyes of adults. And how I did that, one of the first books I read was the dictionary because I thought it was a book and I was supposed to read it. And I started using intelligence that I either was born with or gained through activities such as this to appeal to adults so they saw me as smart and therefore worthy of protection in order to survive people like my father. And in doing so, I figured out that if people saw me as valuable and saw me as worthy of something, worthy of potential, worthy of protection and survival, that I would be okay. And that was my entire childhood, is figuring out how to make people think that I was worth keeping alive. And that intelligence served me all through my life pretty much, and I was able to go to college, and my mom and him divorced when I think I was 10, but they stopped interacting, and therefore I stopped interacting when I was 7. So I was able to be out of that environment for quite some time. And I utilized that intelligence as much as I could, and eventually pursued a doctorate in clinical psychology. Unfortunately, what happened on the first day of classes at the University of Oregon in Eugene, I was arrested and charged with burglary in the first degree for trying to get possessions back from an ex's residence. And I was very confused at this time because I didn't understand why this was illegal, trying to get your own possessions back. And I eventually took that to trial because I thought that I should. I thought that, there's a burden of proof and there's a benefit of the doubt, and they have to kind of prove that I did something wrong. And a lot of other conditioned things that I was told growing up, especially as a white presenting person and also masculine. I just assumed that I would be getting away with anything they said I did. And I also didn't do anything, so I thought that was at least good enough. Unfortunately, that's not really how the justice system works, and I found that out the hard way. You have to prove that you're innocent. And if you're a poor college kid, didn't come from any type of money or anything like that, it's pretty hard to prove that you didn't do something. And another thing about Oregon's law that I was unaware of is a burglary is if you cross the threshold of a door, and that means half of your foot goes over the entrance of a door frame, and it's an occupied dwelling, that's considered a burglary in Oregon law. And there's also, of course, you have to intend to steal something, which I don't know how they could prove that possibly, but they said that I did. So I was found guilty after a 3-day trial of burglary, sentenced to 60 months in prison at the time, 5 straight years, and went into custody for the first time in my life. Before this, when I was arrested, I was in solitary confinement, and I kind of got used to my mind, for lack of a better word, and how it works. And that was a very strange, disturbing, traumatic, and also interesting experience, to say the least. And I'm not going to get into that because it's way too much to talk about right now. But as I progressed into prison, another thing that I realized is there were a lot of people like me that either straight up weren't at the scene of the crime, never did anything, or were in like a different state, sometimes even a different country. There were also people that did do a lot of crime, and I started to try and understand why, because these were the people I was living with now. And one of the things I realized is that there's not a lot of resources for people that have some type of need or some type of thing they're trying to fulfill. And we don't give them opportunities to fulfill those needs if they mess up in trying to attain them. We just put them in a cage and say, you need to figure that out. You need to rehabilitate yourself. You need to take programming. You need to do what you're told. You need to listen to the correctional officers. You need to listen to staff. You need to do this treatment plan, do this program, and things like that. And then we just expect them to magically get better by themselves. And I quickly realized that if I wanted to get better, or at least improve myself or grow, I had to figure out how to do that alone. And in prison, having cystic fibrosis, the first year was spent trying to explain that I needed medicine, that I needed a breathing treatment, that I needed some type of treatment plan to deal with my symptoms, because I would die without them. It took me, when I was first arrested, it took me 3 full days just to get enzymes to eat. I couldn't eat for 3 days, and they kept saying that I was refusing to eat. When I kept repeating, I actually can't eat, I need enzymes to eat, they listed it as a refusal and denied me food. So, and that was kind of par for the course. That set the stage for prison. It was very similar to that. Everything that I had to do was an uphill battle. It's almost as if you have to explain to someone every single time you're hungry why you need food and why you should be given food in a logical way, and you can't use emotion because they won't listen to you. Imagine trying to do that every single time you wanted, something to eat. And that's basically what I had to do to survive in prison. And the odd thing for me is, over the years, I gained a lot of respect, a lot of loyalty, a lot of things having to do with prison politics, where I had a lot of power, I had a lot of influence. And when I got those things, I started to be able to do such things as start programming, start classes of my own with outside volunteers and with other prisoners. That's where I co-founded Liberation Literacy. It's kind of like an activist collective, uses reading and education in a communal setting. And I was also able to co-create All Rise magazine, and that's a publication where all of the content is by people who have done time or are still doing time. And I was also able to co-found the first gender and sexuality class in the Oregon Department of Corrections. And after doing these things, I started to not have to ask to get breathing treatments, to get medication, to get different things that were coming out in the community, because there's constantly developing new medications, new therapies for cystic fibrosis while I was in prison. They started offering them to me, calling me down to medical and asking if I wanted them, if it was a good idea for me to have, which was very strange experience. But it was nice, not having to explain to everyone constantly that I need to eat. So, as I transitioned out, I was released in November of 2018. It'll be 3 years and, 3, 4, or 5 months. I was told I would have medical insurance when I got out, and that's kind of a given that you're supposed to have. You sign up about a week to a month before your release, and they tell you everything's ready to go when you get out, and I just have to check in with my parole officer, check in with my housing, and I'm good. I'll transition back into society, I'll figure stuff out, try to get employment. And what happened is I got out and I set an appointment for my first checkup for cystic fibrosis to see how much damage has been done to my body over these years. My FEV1, which is a lung volume percentage that they regularly check in testing my cystic fibrosis, went down by about 15 to 18 points, which is quite a lot, actually 15 to 18%. So I went into prison, I think it was 60% FEV1 lung volume, and I left around 41. And for those of you not in the medical field, it's a huge drop. 50% is like 50% lung capacity that a normal person is able to expel. I went down almost 20 points. So that's just one kind of variation. Another thing I realized is that I didn't have insurance, and when I went to my first appointment, I had to get a bill and pay in order to be tested for anything, and then figure out why I didn't get insurance later. Otherwise, I'd have to reschedule, and there's months-long waits for appointments. So I had to just figure out what happened and do everything myself, and how to navigate a system that I was really unfamiliar with because I moved from Eugene to Portland. So that was another aspect that was difficult. Another thing I found out is that I have really bad PTSD. I went to a grocery store to get some groceries, and people were reaching over my cart. They were bumping into me. They were kind of brushing up against me. And I had the first panic attack of my life, and I had to leave the store, go to my car, and take a lot of deep breaths, and come back the next day and try it again. And I don't know why. I have no idea to this day what the reasoning behind that. Of course, prison is not a pleasant place, but it doesn't explain that severity, I guess, for me logically. So that's something that I'm dealing with now. I have trouble with people behind me. Loud, sharp noises, fireworks on the 4th of July are nightmarish. So, but, other than those small things, it was okay. And I was transitioning well, and, I was getting speaking events. I was, talking about my work. I was, doing nonprofit work with the things that I founded in prison. Got involved with MACG, actually, Metropolitan Alliance for the Common Good, and other things. And, things were okay. And then the pandemic hit, right? And having cystic fibrosis, I also have a lowered immune system. And so I was immediately very scared and worried what would happen to me. And I was like, well, I kind of had a good run. Probably this will be it. The second I, go to the grocery store and my mask isn't on properly, or someone takes theirs off, or doesn't even have one on, or I'm walking by someone in the community and, they cough in my direction, that'll be it. But that was okay for me, because when you grow up with cystic fibrosis, you start to get used to death in a very different way. You start to think of it as a comforting thing that will eventually happen, not as a very scary, unknown idea. That will happen years in advance. You kind of get really comfortable and really used to that idea. So I was like, well, I did what I could. I did my best, and I think that's all I can do. So it was okay, but I kept thinking about people in prison, because they can't escape. They can't stay in their house. They can't isolate like we're all being told to do. And they don't have to worry about people like walking by them, but they do have to worry about correctional officers bringing it in, and they have to worry that they don't have access to masks. They don't have access to personal protective equipment. And what can I do about that? And I started to realize not much. None of that is up to me. None of that is up to really anybody, except for maybe the governor. But even then, there's a lot of work to be done to try and get people out of that situation. And the problem is, what do we do with the people? There's constantly back and forth about, our prisons, do they work? Do they need to be reformed? Do they need to be abolished, which is what I believe. And it's just too much work to deal with when there's a pandemic, and we can't get to an answer immediately. It's going to take years. It's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of work. So I was just left hoping that the friends I had on the inside survived like I did. And some of them are still in there, by the way. So another thing that happened is, as the pandemic progressed, we had the wildfires up and down the Pacific Northwest and really the West Coast in general, the whole thing was on fire. And someone with a terminal lung illness, it's not so good. And I had to get in my car and drive down the West Coast until I could breathe again, because I literally couldn't step outside. I couldn't open my window, and it started getting into the house I stayed at. And I straight up couldn't breathe, and I thought that would be it. I thought I was going to die. And, you know, I drove, and I had the privilege of asking from my mother for gas money so I could even do this. But I survived that, right? And the smoke dissipated, and I came back, and once again, there's that pandemic, right? And there was a lot of hope of a vaccine, but there's also a lot of people not understanding the severity of it. There's a lot of people that disagree that it was even a problem. And all of that worried me a lot. And then there's people on Facebook, on my social media, complaining that they feel like they're in prison, in their houses. And when they have to distance, when they have to isolate, when they have to wear masks, when they can't be around their friends, when they can't go to events anymore. And that used to bother me. That used to be like, why would you complain about that when you have no idea what being in a cage feels like? But then I started to realize that we're all just really scared, right? We're confused, and we're trying to understand this. We're trying to go through things together. We're trying to be social creatures that humans are. And this is preventing that. This is stopping that. At the very least, it's confusing that. And that's the thing that I touched on, or I tried to focus on, I guess, is that people weren't complaining about something that they could never understand. They were scared, right? That's behind the words. That's behind what they were saying. And, you know, prison for me reminded me how much love and life is worth, and how much we all seek that as human beings, how much we go through and endure to experience being alive, to experience love, to experience those things that make us so human, so mortal, so flawed. And the beauty of life, the only reason that it's so great is because it ends. That's the only thing making me feel that life is worth living, and is that knowing that this is temporary, knowing that the love I share with someone may not last. That's the point. It's making everything worth it, making everything what you can, making yourself be whole, and in doing so, maybe making someone else feel whole. So please remember that as we go forward. Thank you.